Hello and welcome to the programme which looks at the Holy Land. I am Paul Calvert. Psalm 9 verse 13 from the New King James Bible says this: Have mercy on me, O Lord, consider my trouble from those who hate me, you who lift me up from the gates of death. This interview has been done through an interpreter. I'm with Meir Figdoor, who's here in Tel Aviv area. What was life like for you in Austria, for you as a boy and your family before the war?
We escaped from Austria when Hitler came into Austria in 1938 and annexed Austria to Nazi Germany. And then life changed completely. The Nazis began. Before that, my father had a shop selling wood and metal goods. And we had good relationships with all the neighbors. And I had my grandfather, he points at a picture of his grandfather. He died. And they told me that he signed something and he then lost all his property and all his rights. And this was life. We had Austrian accents, we spoke German, we had many friends. But suddenly, everything changed. The Nazis came, they came to our home, and they forced my father to sign something saying he was a thief and he had stolen things. And we couldn't stay in Eisenstadt where we'd been living. So we escaped and went to the capital city, to Vienna, and we found a small apartment, a small flat with one room near the Jewish community, and there were other Jews there. We were very poor, and there was me and my father, my mother, and my brother and sister. His sister's name was Rivka. And we were in this apartment, and we remained there for the time being. And my mother would go to the Jewish community center, and she wanted to get out. She said, we can't continue like this. We can't continue living like this. And thousands of Jews were standing outside the Jewish community center. We want to get out. We want to get out. And they filled in some form to go to Palestine. But it was impossible to get in, to register. There was a ship on the Danube River, which runs through Vienna, and it only had 500 places. And on the Danube, you could travel from Vienna via Budapest and all the way to the Black Sea. The Danube opens into the Black Sea. And they didn't put us on the list. Only people that were rich and Zionists and they took the farmers, people who knew about agriculture, but businessmen and tradesmen, other people, they weren't interested in taking them to Palestine. And there was also my grandfather and grandmother, and they said, no, your family can't get out. And then my grandmother died. And my mother said that in a dream, her mother, his grandmother, said, go to the Gestapo in Vienna, and there's a captain there called Captain Koch. She got up in the morning, put on her best clothes, and she went to the Gestapo. There's a sign in Vienna, even today I've seen it, saying this is where the Gestapo had their offices in Vienna. And my mother got to the Gestapo. There was the SS there. What do you want? Did you get an invitation to come? Were you told to come here? And they pushed her out. You're a Jew, go away. And what luck did she have? The Captain Koch was looking out of the window, and he saw this, and he called to my mother, what do you want, Jewess? And my mother came and said to him, they haven't put us on the list, and we can't get out. And he asked, what's your name? He picked up the phone, and he called the Jewish community office in Vienna, someone called Gerel. What about the Figdoor family? Put them on the list. My mother came to the Jewish community center, and Gerel said, you went to the Gestapo and you came back alive? And he put them on the list. And this is how that my mother saved our whole family. So we went into this ship on the Danube. There was very little space, and we sailed down the Danube to the Black Sea. I was only 3 years old at that time. But on the way, via Budapest, through Czechoslovakia and other places, and people were jumping in the water to try and get out of Europe. And finally, we got to the Black Sea, and then the Dardanelles and through to the Mediterranean. We were in an old ship called the Atlantic. So we got on this old Atlantic, the ship, And there were maybe 2,000 people from Austria and all kinds of places in Europe, Jews escaping from the Nazis. It was very hard on the ship, very difficult. There wasn't enough water or food. We managed to get a little from Turkey. There were many people who were sick with typhus and malaria. Many of them died. People died. And I was on the deck and I saw the aluminium slide where they would slide the coffins of the dead people into the water. We were traveling and then there was a storm on the sea and they said, everybody quickly up on the deck. And if the ship tips over to one side, run quickly to the other side. So we ran from side to side to stop the ship from sinking. And we continued traveling. And then we saw in the way a German submarine. And everyone started shouting, singing the Shema Israel because they saw the Nazi submarine. He didn't come up and damage us. So we continued traveling. My sister, Rivka, she was about 1.5, 2 years old. She died on the ship. I still have a photo of her as a very young baby. Should he bring the photo to show us? So this is a very old photo, obviously, of my sister when she was about 1.5, 2 years old. After a lot of suffering, difficulties, hard times, finally we saw the mountains of Haifa. And everybody thought, after 2,000 years, finally we are arriving in Israel. And in front of us there were 2 more ships. One was called Milus. The other one was called the Pacific. And we were on the Atlantic ship. There were 3 ships that arrived near Haifa. Suddenly, after all this suffering, we wanted to get out in Haifa. They tell us, no, there is an escape ship, another ship called the Patria, and you're all going to be transferred to the Patria. You're not coming into Israel because of the white paper that the British government had put out at that time. So Jews weren't allowed to land. There are problems with the Arabs and Israelis, Palestinians, so we can't let you in, the British said. We don't want to create more problems. They'd forgotten Balfour completely by that time, and everybody should get off their ships and go on to the Patria. And I remember that there was a ladder going from the ship to get onto the Patria. And my mother said, and we were one of the very last ones. And I remember so well that my father called out to my mother, why are we always the last? And you want to clean the ship before we leave? Why are we always the end of the line? We got down off our ship onto the harbour and suddenly we heard an explosion, boom. And there was an explosion on the Patria ship. And again, our mother, by making us the end of the line, had saved our lives because we weren't on the Patria when it exploded. There was shouting and crying, and the parents were looking for their children were looking for their parents, and 256 of the immigrants who had arrived escaped the Nazis and arrived at Haifa, and they drowned on this Patria disaster. A few meters from the land of Israel. There is a young man here. His name is Mickey Spiegel. I met him now. He was also on the Atlantic, so not a young man any longer, with his parents. They came off the Atlantic, and all his relatives perished on the Patria. He was 1 year old, and a young man, he doesn't know who it was even up to today, rescued this 1 year old baby. And the rest of his family, he was the only one left of his whole family. And they told him there is some kind of club that I'm registered with. So he came to find me and to tell me his story. We were together on the Atlantic, but his parents were already on the Patria, and they were hurrying off to get on the Patria, and therefore they perished. So they thought, as we've been spared and saved from the Patria disaster, perhaps they'll let us stay in Israel. But they sent us to the Athlete detention camp, which is south of Haifa on the coast. We were 2 weeks there. And I remember the English soldiers were trying to drive us out again. And I saw people talking in the camp. Tomorrow morning, the English are going to take us away again. And I remember with fear all night, I cried and shouted like somebody crazy because I got this fear what was going to happen. What did they decide to do? These English gentlemen. So the Jews decided that what they'd do is that they take off all their clothes and go to bed naked, because the English are gentlemen, so they won't try and move us if we're naked. So they all took all their clothes off, thinking they won't move us now because we're all naked. They're too polite. So a lot of English soldiers came in the morning with blankets. They put the blankets around the people, and then they threw them into a truck covered in blanket to put them on another ship to take them away. And from there we were taken by ship to the island of Mauritius, via the Suez Canal, the Red Sea, and towards India. We went past Madagascar, and then we arrived at Mauritius. It's an island off the east coast of Africa. And they built a camp there, one camp for women and children. And in the prison, I can't remember its name, the men were put into the prison, the island prison, and the women and children were put in tin huts, and there was a gate separating the women and children from the men. And we lived in huts, and the beds were one next to the other. It was very, very crowded. Small children, women, and I used to jump around from bed to bed around the whole hut, because it was very easy to do. For me, it was actually interesting. There were papayas and lychees growing on the trees, and once I got lost, and they were looking for me in the night, and he was up for all kinds of adventures in that situation. My father was working as a shoemaker. His mother was doing some kind of work as well, running from place to place, trying to do some kind of work and earn a little money. And we ate all kinds of different foods, British foods, but also the fruits, the tropical fruits. They brought me something spicy once to eat. And he thought it was something Mauritian, but it turned out to be British Marmite. And it was kind of spicy. And when he eats Marmite today, somebody gave him some, he said, "That reminds me of Mauritius." It's a spread that you put on your bread. It's a yeast spread. And it tastes kind of spicy. And that's what he remembers. I was 5 years on Mauritius from age 3 to age 8. They had a little school there, and there was someone responsible for the children. Her name was Mrs. Gilbert. She shouted at me and even hit me once because I was dancing on the piano. I was very naughty, and the teachers in the school were not that good at discipline. And many times I didn't know something, for example, a word in Hebrew when we were studying Hebrew. So she took me out of class, and I just wandered around, did my own thing. I always went to the gate between the men in the prison and the women and children camp next to it. And I wanted to visit my father. Later on, they allowed the mothers with their children to visit the fathers in the prison. At the beginning, it wasn't allowed. The men slept in small rooms 2 meters by 1 meter. It was a big balagan, a lot of confusion there. Once my father was very sick, and the doctors even said he might not survive, but he did. There were a lot of experiences I had there, and I just used to wander around every day, see what I could find. At the beginning it was very difficult. Then gradually things got a bit easier. They removed some of the restrictions. They were a bit kinder to us. Once everybody gathered together and they announced, "Hitler has died, has been killed." But it wasn't true. It was just Stauffenberg who had tried to kill him, but he hadn't succeeded. And Hitler actually hadn't died at that time. So we carried on. There were a number of people who committed suicide in that place. And different families lost members of their families. There was a lot of sickness there as well. So we went through difficult life, but slowly it got a little easier until once we were inside a closed camp, locked in, and Mrs. Gilbert took us, all the children, to Port Louis for a trip. And this I remember very well, even up to today. And in Port Louis, suddenly I saw cars driving and bicycles, and I looked, and I always wanted something like this, to have a bicycle or to ride in a car. And then she bought us ice cream, and I even remember to today. This was such a miracle, a wonder to eat ice cream. And then she took us to the cinema, and it was an experience that I will never forget for the whole of my life. And finally, after this life for 5 years in Mauritius, there were cyclones there, the weather could be very bad and stormy. Finally, after the war was over, they didn't know what to do with us. So they said, okay, well, you better just return to Palestine. And then we traveled, and I remember this. He told a story that he made friends with some of the sailors on the ship, and they would send him down a very narrow passage where they couldn't fit, but as a small boy he could fit in there, to bring them something from there. And what they were sending him for was to steal beer and bring it up on the deck so they could drink beer. And because he was so small, he was able to do that. And they were his good friends, and he didn't realize what he was doing, so he just thought these sailors were so friendly and nice to him, and that he was doing what they told him to do. And they were rejoicing because he kept bringing them free beer that he'd stolen. And I was very happy. And he didn't know why these sailors were all so loving and kind and nice to him and smiling all the time. And later on in life, he realized what he'd been doing and why they'd been so friendly to him. So I used to wander around on the deck, and there's an English sailor, and he looked a bit sad. And I said to him, when will we get to Haifa? And he said, tomorrow morning. And I said, how can that be? On the horizon, all I can see is the sea, the ocean. I can't see any land. And actually it was true. Finally, we arrived in Haifa, and everybody was singing and blessing and saying the Shema, and we were so happy. We went down from the ship to the port, and there were women from Vitso, which is a charitable organization, and they gave us gifts and grapes to eat. And he was so happy with these grapes, he thought they were like jewels, so he put them in his pocket. And then he realized there was grape juice coming out the bottom of his pants, from his trousers. And then they took us to a home for new immigrants, and I ran outside to the port, and I heard one of the newspaper sellers shouting out, Yediot Achronot is the name of the newspaper. And I ran back and I said to my mother, and I said, do you know what they're saying here? Idiot Achronot, the last idiots. Because he hadn't understood what they were saying. And I found this language so strange and funny and unfamiliar. And they bought us clothing and helped us out. And because people were wearing shorts, he thought they were wearing underpants. And he said, is this how people walk around here in their underpants? After a day or two in the new immigrants' house, suddenly they took us in a truck to a place called Kfar Avraham. It means Abraham's village. We got out of the truck, and there were many people standing there. They called the people forward. Who is going to take this family? Who wants to take that family? And my dad went with family Huber. And who's going to take this boy? He was talking about me. Bornstein family, please. So you take this boy. Every family took someone to live with them for the time being, because we didn't have anywhere to live. So this Bornstein family where I was, they went out to work and they left me alone. And they left me alone at home. And I was crying, and I caused them a lot of trouble because I was afraid. So then they didn't want to look after me any longer. And then they put me in a children's home. It's called Tkia in Petah Tikva. And from there I went to a proper school for the first time. And they put me in the class, and I couldn't understand a single word. I didn't know any Hebrew. I didn't have any friends. I was crying a lot. And then it was very cold in the winter. I didn't like it. They moved me from place to place, from one institute and children's home to another one. And I didn't know where my parents were, my mum and dad. One day Mum came to visit me in the children's home where he was at the time. And I was crying, I didn't want to stay. And when my mother left in a car, I ran after the car like someone crazy running after. She shouldn't leave. But she didn't take me at that time. Finally, one day, I didn't like the children's home. But finally I began to learn a little Hebrew, and I started to get a few friends. And there were still problems with the English soldiers. They were looking for Begin, terrorists, and an unpleasant situation. And finally, one day, Mum came and took me home. Where was our home? It was next to Rosh Ayin, in an immigrants' camp. And we got a room with a kitchen, 2 beds, and the bathrooms were 100 meters away outside for everybody. And I went into this apartment and I saw the 2 beds. We had kind of refrigerator with ice, and I cried and I said, is this for us, for our family? Finally, we have a place just for our family. So that was, P.S., one of the happiest moments that I remember, that we had a family home, however tiny it was. And outside they were raising chickens. And I was in my home. They wanted to kill one of the chickens to eat it, and I started to cry. I said, no, you can't. Don't touch the chickens. Don't touch them. So I grew up in the land. There was the War of Liberation, the First War in 1948.
Do you remember what happened in 1948 when Israel became a nation?
Yes, I remember very well. Then I was still in the children's home, and every time they brought us the news, the improvements, that we conquered these Arabs, and then all of us gathered next to the radio. The old Jerusalem, the old city, the Arab Legion has conquered the old city of Jerusalem. So that was a hard... Before that, when we came from Mauritius, we visited the Western Wall. It was a very narrow space. And that time they had to put the men and women together because there was so little space. But we did. We were taken to visit the Western Wall. And there were all the wars. And then I was in a professional school. And then I went into the army. And I fought in the 6-day war in the Sinai, face to face, fighting the Egyptians. And we had to run in the night. And we conquered Dumkate.
As someone who's escaped the Holocaust, what do you think of the situation today, particularly in Europe, with a lot of anti-Semitism that's happening today, again in Europe?
I remember that I visited in Vienna, and I was very surprised to see in the former Jewish area there are many Haredi Jews now living there. We cried and escaped, and now the Jews have come back to Vienna, and they come back into Germany and Berlin as well. There was a mayor in Austria called Rohrbach. He was a friend of my father's, and he said to my father, come back and I'll give you a shop and everything that you had before. Just when everything's over and the Nazis are gone, come back to Austria, come back here. And my father had no intention of ever returning to Austria, and he worked here. He did similar work. He worked very hard and brought a little bit of money home and gradually sort of built up business again. And we had a difficult life to start with in the beginning. My mother would go from house to house trying to sell things, make a little money. When the British were still here, he didn't have money for the bus, so he would walk everywhere, and he used to walk for an hour to get to his work and then walk back another hour afterwards. It was a difficult life with the British soldiers here. We didn't know who else could help us. We just had to do the best for ourselves. At the beginning, we were very hungry the whole week, but on the Sabbath, Shabbat, we always had a good meal. We always made sure we saved money for that. We kept the Sabbath and did a nice meal for the Sabbath.
Since October the 7th, have you been worried about the Jews around the world in the anti-Semitism that's been rising?
No. I think that Jews, that it'll be even harder for them, and they should know that Jews, all the suffering for 2,000 years, not just the Holocaust. Jews were murdered, killed, persecuted all through that time. They drove them out. Yeah, they were pushed out of Spain 500 years ago, and the Jews suffered so much. And the place for the Jews is just here in Israel. This is where they should be. And we've seen what's going on throughout the world, and that's the only solution, the only answer, the only way. And I see the hatred that is still there.
Thank you for joining us today. Pray that God will move by his mighty power in the Holy Land and bring his peace.